Good morning, everyone. Hello. I hope you all can hear me. I welcome you all today in this web session. And as you prepare to appear for CA finals in November 2020, we are here with an exclusive web session in association with CAClubindia.com and with Sandeep Khetan. And to provide you certain suggestions and insights as to the best possible way in which you should approach learning about accounting and India's in particular. To begin the session, I'll introduce quickly Sandeep. So Sandeep is a national leader for EY Financial Accounting and Advisory FAS in India. And Sandeep has 20 plus years of experience in advisory and consulting industry. He has graduated in commerce from University of Calcutta and has cleared his CA in 2000 with All India rank 14. He has also done US CPA and company secretary courses and is an alumni of IIM Ahmedabad. And Sandeep was part of the India's implementation committee of ICI and has been part of several groups formed for for issuance of implementation guidance under India's. And as he regularly engages with standard setters and regulatory bodies in India to help grow the accounting profession. Sandeep, I welcome you in today's session.
Thank you, Praveen. Thanks and good morning to everyone. So for those who have taken out time to join and kind of participate in this conversation. So we have a very interesting kind of an agenda for you. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of accounting standards, which is Ind AS 109 and Ind AS 115. We will follow it up with a quiz session. So we've got some 7 interesting questions lined up for you. And then we're going to quickly hope you will be able to participate and share your answers to those. And then we have a kind of prizes for top 3 winners as well. And then I'm going to talk to you about, what is it you need to do to prepare better for your exams in terms of when you attempt your papers. What is it you should start? What is it you need to always keep in mind? More importantly, when you attempt your paper on financial reporting for CA final. I'm going to talk to you about that, and then we'll be able to take few questions as we progress. So feel free to type in your questions, anything as during the conversation, and I'll try and kind of take some of them as well. We don't have a lot of time. The topics are complex, but my objective here is to give you a high level understanding as to how Ind AS 109 or Ind AS 115, what's the meaning of it, what is it you need to know as you prepare these subjects, as you go about learning some of these accounting standards. So moving forward on the next slide on talking about Ind AS 109. So on Ind AS 109, Praveen, if you just go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So the financial instrument is something which has been new in terms of as an accounting concept for us, and financial instrument is something which is all pervasive. Just kind of a second, Praveen, can we go back to the previous slide? I think the slides was just stay here. So financial instrument is something which is all pervasive, and it is new from an Indian accounting standard perspective. Under the old existing Indian accounting standards, we never had an opportunity to learn in detail about financial instruments. So when we all did our CA, this was not there, and this in a way was introduced through AS 30, 31, 32. But they were never become mandatory. So after the introduction of Ind AS, these in a way became mandatory, and the simple, at the very high level, the definition of financial instrument is it is something which originate out of a contract which results into a financial asset for one entity and a financial liability or equity of another enterprise. So it's very important and fundamental for you to understand the topic is to understand this definition as to what is a financial instrument. So financial instrument is nothing but something which originate out of a contract which results into a financial asset for one entity and a financial liability or equity of another enterprise. So for me to give you a very simple example of this is cash. So the cash which is there, or the currency is also a financial instrument. And why it is a financial instrument? It is an asset for you, for the individual who owns the cash, and it's a liability for the central bank of the country which has issued that currency. So it is important for you to understand that it is not something which is originating out of a statute. For example, income tax payable. Income tax payable is not a financial instrument, right? Because that liability originate out of a statutory requirement and not out of the contract or arrangement between two counterparties. So it has to be an arrangement between two parties which results into a financial assets for one entity and a financial liability or equity for another enterprise. So if you look at cash, if you look at accounts receivable, if you look at accounts payable, if you look at investments in equity share, if you look at borrowings, what you have, if you look at security deposit, if you look at derivative financial instrument, and we will talk about derivative financial instruments slightly. So in a way, when you look at the balance sheet construct of your balance sheet, on the right hand side of a balance sheet where you have cash, you have receivables, you have current investments, and then you have long-term investments, and you take out your property, plant and equipment and inventory. If you take out property, plant and equipment and inventory and prepaid assets, everything virtually is actually a financial asset. And then when you look at on the liability side, you look at the equity box, and then you look at your liabilities which are payable, which is borrowings, which is other kind of payables, accounts payable. All of them are actually financial liabilities, and you take out your provisions. The provisions are not a financial liability, but your accounts payable, your loans, all of them, and capital, all of them are actually financial liability or equity of enterprise. So the coverage of the standard is fairly wide. And that's where the examples, what you see here is a financial asset, a financial liability, or equity. Now, when I look at the CA final paper, the lot of questions which have come up is around the whether an instrument is an equity or a liability, and a lot of questions you will see that which are on compound instrument, right? So what is an equity is also important for you to understand. Equity is something which where there is no contractual obligation for me to repay, or I can avoid the repayment of that liability to any third party, from that perspective. So if I have the ability to avoid the repayment of the money which I have received from an external party, that is actually an equity by whatever name called. So if you have received, let's say, a mandatorily convertible debenture, right, and which is convertible for fixed conversion ratio, and there's a lot more theory to it. But to put it very simply, if I have received a mandatorily convertible debenture or a preference share, compulsorily convertible or a mandatorily convertible, that is an equity. But what happens in many of these scenarios, you will see that I have to mandatorily pay interest. So there is an outflow of interest which is going to happen. Now that outflow of interest is what you contractually you cannot avoid. Then the extent of interest which I need to pay, that becomes the liability. So it is important for you to understand that what is financial asset, what is financial liability, and what is equity, right? And it is something which originates out of a contract between two parties, which results into a financial asset for one entity and a liability or equity for another enterprise. It's very, very fundamental and important for you to understand. So when you look at any standard, right, you have to understand that the standard in terms of the definition, in terms of the scope, and then in terms of the recognition, and then measurement, and then derecognition, and then disclosure. So when you look at the standard on financial instrument, we have the scope section. Now the scope of the financial instrument, when you go by this definition, is fairly wide, right? But not everything is required to be accounted for by way of this principle of this standard. Just let me give you a very simple example. Let's say there's another standard, Ind AS 27, which talks about accounting for investments in subsidiaries, joint venture, and associate. Now, investment in subsidiaries, joint venture, and associate is also an equity investment, and it also qualifies qualifies within the scope of the standard. So the standard then scopes out that if there is another accounting standard which provide guidance for that particular kind of transaction, you will account for it under that accounting standard and not under Ind AS 109. So it is important for you to understand that Ind AS 109 is in a way become a residual standard for all other types of financial instrument which are not covered in any other accounting standard, whether it is insurance, whether it is leasing, whether it is investments, consolidation, so on and so forth. So, or for that matter, retirement benefits, right? The coverage of the standard is fairly wide. So now if you move to the next slide, Praveen, if you can move to the next slide. So then I wanted to talk to you about accounting for financial assets, right? And when you think about the financial assets, there are three types of financial asset, okay? Whether it is a debt, derivative, or equity. There are three types of financial asset: debt, derivative, or equity. Debt can be of two types: a vanilla debt or a hybrid debt instrument. A hybrid debt instrument, which has a component of a debt or an equity in a way. So when you look at any kind of financial asset, what you need to be clear in your head is that what is the risk which is associated with that kind of financial asset, right? So let me give you a very simple example. When you buy debentures, when you buy bonds, when you go and do fixed deposit in your bank, right? The risk which you are carrying in that asset is your liquidity risk and your credit risk and your interest rate risk, right? There are three types of risk which are inherent in a debt type instrument, which is a credit risk, that whether the debt holder, the person who is issued the debt, whether that person will be able to repay the debt or not. Then there is an interest rate risk, right? That let's say you have locked in yourself at 6% or 7% or 10%. Now the market interest rate may change, as a result of which there is a gain or loss on your investment which you have made. The third risk is the liquidity risk. So for example, the debt is up for maturity, let's say on 31st of March, the debt issuer may not have enough money to redeem it on time. So there could be a liquidity risk, right? Which is, let's say, a common example of liquidity risk is, let's say, account receivable, right? If you have account receivable, which is 30-day credit, at times the debtors may pay in 60 days, 90 days, 20 days. So there is a liquidity risk which is attached to that kind of financial asset. So think of a financial asset, think of a risk which is associated with that financial asset. So now when you think about a derivative, right? A derivative has risk which is attached to the underlying a variability, which is a credit risk, interest rate risk, a price risk, commodity risk, so or the exchange risk. It is linked to the variable, right? A derivative derives its variable value from a variable, right? And that variable is nothing but an index in majority of the situation. So when you think of the derivative, you got to understand the index at which the derivative is linked to derive its value. And then you have the equity financial asset, and equity, the risk which is inherent in any equity instrument is the price risk, okay? So to put it very simply, for you to understand the financial asset, you need to understand the risk which is attached to that financial asset. If you go and buy shares in the stock exchange, you are actually dealing with price risk, right? If you go and do security deposit with bank, like you deposited money, let's say with Yes Bank, right? What are the risks you are carrying? You're carrying the interest rate risk, you're carrying the liquidity risk, and you're carrying the credit risk. That Yes Bank may default tomorrow, or the interest rate may change in the market, or there is a delay in repayment which happened because of the moratorium, right? So for a debt instrument, there are different types of risk. For an equity instrument, there are different types of risk, and accounting for the same is dependent upon the type of risk which you are exposed to. So now you look at the financial asset you have, and then there are two fundamental tests which you need to assess. One is called the contractual cash flow test, is what you see on the slide. The contractual cash flow test means that am I exposed to the repayment of the principal and the repayment of the interest. So the only risk which is inherent in that instrument is actually the interest rate risk and the credit risk, right? And liquidity risk is often a part of the credit risk. So you are exposed to, which is what is called as SPPI test. What we call it as SPPI test, solely the payment of principal and interest. So the only risk which is there in that instrument is solely the payment of principal and the interest. If that test is failed, right, then you will do accounting for those instruments at fair value through profit and loss account, which is what you see. If you fail the contractual cash flow test, then the accounting for those financial assets under Ind AS 109 is as per fair value through profit and loss account. Okay. Now, assuming that you have met the contractual cash flow test, there where my risk in that instrument is nothing but the interest rate risk and the credit risk. And that is what, let's say, example of that is security deposit, right? Or a bank deposit or an account receivable or cash, what you have in your bank, right? That is where these risks will met. So if passes the test, then the other test is what you need to assess is the business model test. What is my business model test? So what's the business model of the company for that kind of financial asset? If the business model for that kind of financial asset is hold to collect the contractual cash flow. So let's say you've given this deposit for a 5-year period. I'm going to keep it for 5 years and I'm going to collect maturity after 5 years. So my business model is hold to collect. No, my business model is actually I have this for 5 years, but I may want to sell at any point in time. I don't know, right? And then that becomes the number 2, which is objective that results in collecting contractual cash flow and selling financial asset, or it is neither 1 or 2. Okay, it neither 1 nor 2 nor 3 in a way, neither 1 or 2. That means it is it fails the business model test. That's what my business model is. So if that been the case, right, and that's where the accounting is what you need to choose. So if it is hold to collect contractual cash flow and you have not opted for conditional fair value option, then the accounting for that is amortized cost, right? If it is objective that result in collecting contractual cash flow and selling financial asset, and you have not opted for the fair value option, the accounting for that is fair value through OCI with the recycling of the gains, in future in period. If it is neither 1 or 2, then again the accounting is fair value through P&L. Accounting for derivatives is always fair value through profit and loss account, unless you're doing hedge accounting. We're going to talk about in more detail in future. For equity instrument, it is also at fair value through profit and loss account, and there is an exception to that route. If it is not held for trading, it is an equity share which is not held for trading, and you as company wants to choose as that I want to designate this at inception to account for this at fair value through other comprehensive income, and that's an irrevocable option. That never go back to P&L. That is what is called fair value through other comprehensive income with no recycling. So this slide is actually a very good summary to put together the entire accounting or all possible accounting of financial asset in one single frame, right? So again, very quickly to summarize, financial assets are of 3 types. Debt, it can be hybrid or pure debt, or derivative or equity. The accounting for derivative and equity is always fair value, right? Now the accounting for debt or hybrid is you got to first assess the contractual cash flow test, which is solely the payment of principal and interest. If you pass that test, that the risk which is inherent in that instrument is the credit risk and the interest rate risk, then you go to the business model test. You look at the business model. What is my business model? Is to hold to collect till maturity. Then you can account for it at amortized cost, provided you have not opted for fair value option accounting. If my business model is hold to collect, but I may decide to sell, then you need to account for it at fair value through other comprehensive income. If it is neither 1 or 2, then you have to necessarily account for it at fair value through profit and loss account. I think that's the accounting for all types of financial asset is what you will look through in Ind AS 109. So Praveen, if you move forward to the next slide, I now wanted to talk to you about impairment of financial assets. So that's again what is called as expected credit loss model. And let me give you a very simple example of expected credit loss model. What does it mean, right? Now today, the current practice of providing for doubtful debt was incurred credit loss model, right? And incurred credit loss, let's say you've given 100 rupees to a friend, right? And your friend is actually, and the friend made a promise that I'm going to repay you after 6 months, okay? And then you believe that this guy is good, this guy will pay me back. But at the end of the 6 months, you realize that this guy is not going to pay you, right? The money is going bad, and the existing accounting was this money is bad. You got to provide for this, which is called incurred credit loss model, that the money is now bad. You provide for 100 rupees as provision for bad debt. Now the expected credit loss model, what it expects that the moment you are extending credit, to a counterparty, there is a credit risk. And if there is a credit risk, there is going to be a default on all your arrangements. So it is like saying that now if you simply extend the same example that I've given money to 100 friends, okay, 100 rupees to 100 of my friends. Now you know that 98 of them may return money, 2 of them will not return money, right? And that's the risk which you are trying to take, right? And you know that when you are extending credit, that there is a risk that the money is not going to come back. That's the fundamental principle of risk management, that there is a credit risk and there is a risk of default, and hence the money may not come back. What the expected credit loss method expects you to do is that you start building in the reserve on day 0 itself. The moment you extend credit, you build a model that how much of this can potentially go bad, and you start providing for this. And that's what is called as, it can be a general approach or a simplified approach. There are multiple methods which are provided for in the standard. And again, the key for you to understand is that you go to start building in the reserve the moment you are exposed to a credit risk. And then there are methodology which is out there for you to start building in the reserves around that. So if you move to the next slide, in terms of revenue recognition. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about Ind AS 109. So try and understand what is Ind AS 109, financial instrument, something which originate out of a contract between two parties, results into a financial asset and a financial liability or equity of another enterprise. The simple examples we talked about: cash, account receivable, accounts payable, equity, investments, borrowings, etc., etc. And then we talked about accounting for financial assets, and then we talked about impairment. There are a whole host of other things like derivatives, like derecognition, like disclosure presentation, which again, we'll talk, separately. So now I move to my discussion on Ind AS 115. Ind AS 115 is an accounting standard on revenue recognition. So up till now, we were supposed to do accounting as per Ind AS 18. Now the new standard is Ind AS 115, which is very much part of the syllabus. Now the Ind AS 115 says that from a revenue recognition perspective, it's a 5-step approach, for revenue recognition perspective. On the left is what you see as things which are scoped out. So if it is a leasing arrangement, you go to Ind AS 116, right? If it is an insurance arrangement, you go to Ind AS 104. If it is a financial instrument, you go to Ind AS 109. If they are non-monetary exchanges without any commercial substance, you don't account for it under Ind AS 115. So the key is that you've got to make sure that you are covered as part of the scope of the standard. Once it is covered as part of the scope of the standard, then there are 5-step approach. The step number 1 is identify the contract with the customer. I need to have a contract. Now the form of the contract can be verbal, can be written, can be emails, can be any other form. The key expectation under the standard that it is something which has to be enforceable under the law, right? Under the law, this form of arrangement is enforceable. Then only it is presumed that the contract exists, right? So there has to be identify the contract with the customer. That is step number 1. Step number 2, identify all your performance obligation in the contract. Now, this is a fairly important step, that you got to identify the performance obligation. Now, in many vanilla arrangement, there is only one performance obligation to say that let's say you place an order on Amazon that I want to buy this laptop, and then Amazon has a performance obligation to deliver the laptop to you. So there is only one performance obligation, which is to deliver the laptop. Now, if you further dissect it, and now you say that Amazon actually has 2 performance obligation in that arrangement, which is one is the laptop. The second is the whole delivery obligation. Amazon has also undertaken an obligation to deliver the goods to your place of order, right? Or your address. So there are actually 2 performance obligation in that arrangement. One is the laptop. The other one is the delivery obligation, right? So you got to identify all performance obligation. A very common example we see, let's say you go and buy a car, right? When you go and buy a car, the car is, let's say you purchase the car, then it comes with a maintenance, then it comes with warranty, so on and so forth. So the dealer may say that there are 3 free maintenance, and then there is a warranty which you may want to buy. So depending upon the contract arrangement, you need to be able to identify the performance obligations. Okay. Now, once you have identified the performance obligation, then the key question is that, do I need to account for these performance obligations differently, or together. And the standard suggests that if you were to assess those performance obligations, to say that are they capable of being distinct and distinct within the context of the contract. So they have to be capable of being distinct and distinct within the context of the contract. So if they are capable of being distinct and distinct within the context of the contract, means what? They are a separate performance obligation. So in this arrangement of Amazon laptop and delivery, one can argue that there are two separate performance obligations. Now, let's say if I'm now paying 50,000 rupees for purchase of that laptop, the issue is that determine the transaction price, the third step. So I have to identify the contract. The second step, determine the performance obligation. The third step is to determine the transaction price. How much is the contractual consideration which is inherent in that standard? The contractual consideration inherent in that standard is the transaction price, which is what I need to pay. So 50,000 rupees in my example is the contractual consideration. Now allocate the transaction price to each of the performance obligations. So this 50,000 rupees, now I need to allocate to the laptop and to the delivery obligation in a predefined manner, right? And there are multiple methods which you need to use, which you can use to allocate this contract consideration to each of the performance obligation. And this is important because one is a sale of product, the other one is rendering of service. One may be delivered today, the other one may be fulfilled tomorrow. So as you know, accounting is a period concept. So we have to get it right to say that how much revenue I need to accrue in this period versus in the another period. How much revenue is actually from sale of product, how much is from rendering of services, right? And how much provision I need to carry, for future revenues, etc. in my financial statement. So you got to allocate the transaction price to each of the performance obligation and then recognize the revenue as these performance obligations are fulfilled. So again, I'm going to repeat these 5 steps. Identify the contract consideration, identify the contract with the customer, determine your performance obligation under the arrangement, then determine the transaction price, then allocate the contract consideration to each of the performance obligation, and then recognize revenue as each of these performance obligations are fulfilled. So that's the 5-step approach for revenue recognition is what you need to keep in mind. I'm going to move to the next slide to talk you some more complexity. So contract identification, if you look at step 1, criteria for recognizing a contract, it has to be enforceable under the law. So if you are in India, is this arrangement is enforceable under Indian law? If you're transacting with US customer, is it enforceable with the US law? So on and so forth. What is the duration of this contract? Can it be terminated at will, or it has a duration? If it can be terminated at will, then again, then the standard says no contract exists. Then that means as you fulfill, you keep on recording revenue, so on and so forth. Do you need to combine contracts? There are multiple contracts which are signing with a customer at about the same time. So do I need to look at them individually, or do I need to look at them together? Contract modifications. If you're changing your contract, how do I deal with that accounting? Is it a new contract, or is it a continuation of the existing contract? So, and then you look at identification of the performance obligation. What are the promised goods and services? What are my performance obligation, which are being capable of being distinct and distinct within the context of the contract? Am I giving assurance type warranty or a service type warranty, right? So if you're giving an assurance type warranty, then it is not a separate performance obligation. With a service type warranty, it's a separate performance obligation. Is there an arrangement? Is a principal to principal or a principal versus agent? Because if it is a principal to principal, it results into a gross revenue recognition. If it is a principal to agent, you end up recording a net revenue of the likes. Let's say a lot of these e-commerce companies like Make My Trip, Yatra, and all of these companies which are providing these agent type services, you record revenue on a net basis and not on a gross basis. But a lot of other, e-commerce websites which provides services, and they may record revenue on a gross basis depending upon the type of the arrangement, and who takes what responsibility. And then similarly, the transaction price. What's the base transaction price? What's the variable consideration? Is there a significant financing component? Is there a consideration? Is there I'm going to pay back? Is there a discount which will go back to you? Are there any non-cash considerations? So all of these factors is what you need to understand as you determine the contract consideration. And then I need to allocate the contract consideration to each of the performance obligation, and I may do based on relative fair value method, or I may do based on reverse residual method, or I may do it based on residual method as well. So there are multiple methods which are prescribed in the standard, which you need to understand and follow while you're doing the allocation of these contract consideration, and then you record this revenue as and when these are fulfilled. So many times you will record revenue as goods are delivered, right? Now goods are delivered to the customer place of delivery. Many times you may be able to record revenue as goods are dispatched. Many on service arrangement, you may be able to record revenue on a percentage completion basis, or you may only be able to record revenue once all the service obligations are fulfilled. It all depends upon the contractual arrangement between parties to the contract as to how and when you're going to record revenue. Can you record revenue immediately? Can you record revenue over a period of time? Or you record revenue when all your obligations are in a way fulfilled? So that's a 5-step approach is what you need to understand in terms of recording revenue, for any commercial arrangement. Again, this is a fairly important standard, and you need to, understand this in a lot more detail as you prepare for your exams. Contract cost, and again, there are some variation to that. If the incremental cost which you incur to acquire the contract itself, then those costs are also eligible for capitalization under the new standard, and you capitalize them and then you amortize them over the period of the contract. A very simple example is that if your sales staff is eligible for a bonus, let's say you sign a contract for 1,000 rupees, as a result of that contract, a sales staff is actually compensated, let's say 2% of the contract value. That 2%, which is 20 rupees in this example, is actually eligible for capitalization, and to be amortized over the period of the contract, which is called cost to obtain a contract. And many times the cost to fulfill a contract is also eligible for capitalization if you're not being able to record revenue for one reason or the other. Then there are multiple transition methods which are prescribed in the standard, and the host of disclosure is what you need to look at as part of the standard. So it's a fairly complex, comprehensive standard, and I would recommend each one of you to spend time, look at the examples, develop your understanding, about the standard as you go around, starting Ind AS 109 or Ind AS 115. But in summary, understand the basic nuance, understand the principle, then it will be far more easier for you to follow the theory and then apply as you try and understand both the topics. So if you move forward to the next slide, Praveen.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that's what I wanted to cover in terms of a quick overview on Ind AS 109 and Ind AS 115. And of course, we'll take some questions as well. I'm going to now hand it back to Praveen to kind of quickly, take some few quizzes, on the topics we've discussed, but they'll be a little wider as well. So Praveen, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you for this exciting walkthrough with Ind AS 109 and 115. So everyone, now we are entering to the quiz. After that, Sandeep will also discuss briefly about how, what are the best practices you should, take while attempting the Ind AS exam. So as far as the quiz is concerned, this is the exciting part here. So these are the terms and conditions. There'll be 7 questions on 109 and 115. And the allocated time would be 10 minutes to each of you. And each question will be of 1 mark. And winners will be decided on the basis of certainly the marks, and then the fastest finger first. And then we'll decide the winners, and we'll try to announce the winners at the end of this webinar. But if we get good number of entries, probably we'll share it during the course of the day. Now the first prize will be, you can see on the screen, the first prize will be Hugo Boss pen worth rupees 3099, and then there's a Bluetooth speaker, portable Bluetooth speaker worth rupees 2000. That's the second prize. And then there's a backpack with a portable USB that would be worth rupees 1000. These are the 3 prizes we'll be giving to the winners, and we will share the link in the chat. I request Neha, if you can share the link in the chat box. Guys, you'll get this link. This is a Google form link. You'll get 10 minutes to submit your answers. When you submit it, after 10 minutes, we'll close the poll. And please let me know if you can get the link. Share Neha, did you share the link? Right. So we have shared the link. Everyone, please let me know if you are unable to access the form. We are starting the poll, and the time starts now. Ramachandra, just a second. Nitin, can you help Ramachandra? He has raised a hand, and he probably have some question. Yeah, Ramachandra, can you please tell me what difficulty you're facing?
I'm not able to see link in the description.
So in the chat box, so on the top of your screen, you'll see three dots. On that, if you'll click on more, there'll you know Alt H, you can also press. You'll see the chat option. You click on it and you can see the link. Did you find the link?
Okay, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, glad. So guys, the time is has started. Nimish, just in this chat bot only you can see the link. I'm separately also sharing it with you. So we are already getting couple of entries. So people are submitting their replies very quickly. As we're left with 8 minutes, so you have 8 more minutes to submit the quiz. Please take your time. Five more minutes to go.
How many responses we've already received, Praveen?
If we're getting pretty good response, but not too many all the correct answers. We saw that you have obviously made all the answers correct. We have also shared the link on Facebook Live,
Awesome.
and we're getting response from that part as well.
Okay.
Yes, Ranveer will be doing a Q&A session as well.
Yeah, so I think what we do, we let people continue because they're taking time, so let them continue to submit. And then we can just, in the interest of time, we can also open up, we can move to the slides.
Right.
And I can talk them through some examination tips. And then we can do Q&A, and they can continue in the background, complete those who are still doing it.
Right.
Yeah,
So
we've exhausted our 10 minutes, right?
Correct.
Right.
So we'll give some additional time to them, I believe.
Sure.
Right. So we are on the next slide, and over to you.
All right, everyone. So I hope you guys are having fun. Can you hear me, Praveen?
Yes.
Yes, awesome. I'm hoping you guys are having fun in terms of looking at all the questions and the answers. So I think it's just an application of some of the principles, okay? And I also attempted that, and I've also got one of them wrong. So don't worry. It is okay to be not have right everything at the first place. But the key is that you got to read the question, you got to then attempt it. And what you see here on the slide is that a few things, which I have kind of again as per my association with some of these kind of setting up process, is the way the whole examination process works, the way the marking process works. You need to there is a marks for everyone. Every step is what you get in the examination paper. It's not necessary for you to get the entire question right, as you attempt those questions. So you need to look at you need to look at that. You need to ensure that whenever you are trying to answer a question, right, you got to list down assumptions basis which you are making that answer. Because many times you will realize that the questions are not very clear. If the questions are not very clear, that's not a problem. When you are writing, and because you can't do anything about it at that point in time, right? But what is important for you is to keep your cool, okay? And as you are thinking of your answer, you make sure that you write your assumptions. And what does the assumptions mean? Assumptions mean your understanding of the question, okay? So you got to write your understanding of the question. Look, this is what my understanding of the question of what you're asking. And basis this understanding is what my response is. So clear your assumptions unless the question is very clear, and then still write your assumptions. These are your 5 fundamental assumptions as you're writing the answer for that particular question, right? Then also focus on working notes, okay? If let's say there is a balance sheet which you need to create at the end of the answer is to create a balance sheet for the revised scheme of things, just don't jump on to just get to the balance sheet. Get to the every step which is required in computation of that balance sheet or drafting of that balance sheet. Make sure that you try and focus on step-by-step solution, okay? Step-by-step solution. So focus on every step of the answer and write that down. Don't only in your head, write in the answer sheet as well, because every step carries a mark, okay? If you get that step right, you may be able to score that half a mark or that 1 mark for that only step, okay? It's important. It's important, for you to get it right, okay? So choose your steps very, write all your steps. And don't try to shortcut the process. That I know the answer, don't jump to the answer just like that. Also write the steps through which you get to the answer. If you don't have time, then of course the answer is more important, okay? But if you have time as you are attempting your question, as you're looking at the question paper, write steps as you attempt your question paper. Provide step-by-step solution, okay? Again, don't jump to the direct answer. Step-by-step solution. That what are the principle, write the theory, why this has been done, write the principle, and then do that step, and then do the next step, and then get to the final answer. So it's important for you to think through a logical way that how you attempt the answer to a particular question. So provide step-by-step solution. And when you look at any accounting standard, the step 1, as I said, is the scope, right? Step 2 is the recognition. The step 3 is the measurement. Step 4 ordinarily is the disclosure. So every accounting standard which has a measurement impact, you got to look at the scope, you got to look at the recognition principle, you got to look at the measurement principle. Recognition means is this covered under this accounting standard? If yes, then how to recognize it, when to recognize it, right? And then measurement is how to measure it. Do I measure it amortized cost? Do I measure it fair value? Do I do it through OCI? Do I record it immediately? Do I record it over a period of time? So on and so forth. The principles of measurement, principles of recognition, the coverage of the standard, and the related disclosure, and the underlying principles. Try and be as detailed in your answer as possible, right? And then focus on application of principles and mathematical accuracy. Many times we end up doing something wrong is because we're not reading the question right? We're not reading the question right. We're not focusing on the dates which is out there against each of these questions, right? So we need to be focused on the dates, that if there is a 1st January, there is a 31st March, there is a 30th June. So you got to look at the dates. That is very important, that unless you get the dates right, many times you will get these computations wrong. So you got to get the dates right. You got to get the amounts right. If you get these 2 things right, because accounting is a period concept, it is very important that in this period, how much revenue, in this period, how much is the impact of fair value, in this period, how much is the profit, or how much is the expense. All of that is you will be able to get to it if you focus on the dates and the amounts. Correlate that very quickly as you are going through the question. Start kind of jotting it down. So 4 very simple principles is that assumptions, make sure your assumptions are stated right. Focus on detailed working note. Try and provide a step-by-step solution. Don't jump to the end answer, and focus on application of principle and mathematical accuracy. And one very other simple tip, as you prepare for your exams, make sure that you guys do revision and you look at last 10 attempts of CA final or a CA inter, depending upon whatever you are doing. You've got to look at all past examination questions and answers. Okay, look at all past 10 attempts examination question, and make sure that you understand the answers, you understand the way they are being answered. That is very, very, very important for you to get it right. And follow this and follow the principles. I'm sure you will do well in your exams as well. So that's what I wanted to share with you in terms of the some tips around examination questions and how do you attempt and how do you prepare. For the preparation, of course, study material is very important. To prepare, the practice is very important, and to prepare your past 10 examination, at least look at for last 10 terms. That means last 5 years is what you need to look at to make sure that you are absolutely comfortable. And of course, you got to take note of the new accounting standards. So this is a new paper altogether. The people are in old syllabus, people are in new syllabus. So depending upon what syllabus you are following, what is going to come, and that's how you try and focus in terms of past paper availables, and make sure that you do enough practice so that you don't lose out. So moving forward, Praveen.
Yeah, thank you, Sandeep. So Sandeep, we received while asking for registrations, students have also shared a couple of questions.
Okay.
And so we can take those questions if that is all right.
Absolutely.
And then we can move on the live Q&A.
Absolutely.
And in the meantime, our team is trying to figure out who's the winner.
Okay.
And we'll try to announce it at the end of the webinar.
Awesome.
All right. So I have a couple of questions and I'll read it for you. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. We have received a question from Vishal Arora from Delhi, and he wants to understand the concept of revenue recognition by e-commerce industry as per Ind AS 115.
Right.
So over to you.
Yeah. So I think it again depends upon how that e-commerce business is organized. So when I look at all the large names which is out here, right? Let's say Flipkart, let's say Amazon, let's say Zomato, let's say Swiggy, let's say Make My Trip, or Yatra, or Snapdeal, right? And there are various other businesses which is out there, right? So a simple principle of revenue recognition is, once you need to understand that, am I the principal in the arrangement or am I the agent in the arrangement, right? And for you to be the principal in the arrangement, the standard looks at 3 criteria. Am I the primary obliger? Who is the one who is taking responsibility for fulfillment of customer obligation? Who has the inventory risk? And who has the latitude in establishing prices? So you got to look at the 3 principal criteria for you need to determine that, am I the principal in the arrangement or am I the agent in the arrangement? So as you know that, Amazon or Flipkart or others of the world, they are mostly like a marketplace arrangement, right? They operate as a marketplace. So let's say I want to sell something. I'm going to go and list my product on the Amazon, and then Amazon provides a medium through which somebody else is going to log in and order. So Amazon is not taking the inventory risk, for example, right? Amazon is maybe responsible for the delivery risk is what they are trying to take, but they don't decide the pricing. I as the seller are going to decide the pricing. For example, I as the seller am taking the inventory risk of that product. So more often than not, for majority of the e-commerce company in the country, the revenue is the gross net revenue is what they end up recording, which in our example, also the Amazon example we had on this, is the net revenue, which is 500 rupees commission is what I'm going to make by selling this mobile phone. So more often than not, the answer is the net revenue, but commission, which is the commission which Amazon is going to make. But in many situations we see, right, that I'm also taking actually the principal. So actually, if let's say I am a website which is not a marketplace, but let's say I am Indigo, right? And I'm Indigo and I'm also selling tickets on my website, right? So I am the primary originator. I'm also providing the service, and then I'm selling tickets. So any revenue which I generate by selling tickets is a gross revenue, is which Indigo going to record if they're selling it through their website. Similarly, if SpiceJet is selling tickets on their website, they record the gross revenue. But if the same ticket is you purchase it from Make My Trip, because the Make My Trip gets a commission on that, Make My Trip will record a net revenue on that arrangement. So depending upon your contractual rights and obligations under the arrangement, you'll end up recording revenue either on a principal, which is on a gross basis, or as an agent, which is on a net basis. And more often than not is what we see the e-commerce companies in the country, they will end up recording revenue on a net basis, because most of the large scale e-commerce platform what we have are of aggregator models, which is a marketplace model where I don't take the inventory risk, where I don't decide the pricing, and hence, though I may be responsible for fulfillment of some of the contractual obligation, but again, I don't take, let's say, post customer contract support. A lot of them may do it because of their own brand reputation and all, but all of these are covered by back-to-back arrangement with the third-party seller. So more often than not, you end up recording revenue on a net basis and not on a gross basis. I hope that helps you have some perspective on this.
Thank you, Sandeep. And we have a comment from Jay Prakash. Jay Prakash is giving us a suggestion that, hope another session is, if you can cover Ind AS 116 leases and Ind AS 33 EPS. So surely, awesome. I'll try to convince Sandeep, to do a session on this. Then moving on, Sandeep, we have a question from Shivani Singh, that is from Rajasthan. And she wants to understand the difference between in Indian Accounting Standards 116 and 17. And she wants to understand why there are two standards for the same term.
Right. So Ind AS 116 is now the new accounting standard on leases, and that is going to be the only accounting standard on leases, which is going to be mandatory for all companies doing Ind AS as a framework of accounting, right? Ind AS 17 was an existing accounting standard which has been superseded by Ind AS 116. And the fundamental difference between Ind AS 116 and Ind AS 17 is accounting in the books of the lessees, right? So let's say, Shivani, if you are staying on rent, right? If you are staying on rent, let's say, staying on rent, and you take a property on rent for a period of 3 years, under the model of Ind AS 17, it qualifies as an operating lease, okay? And let's say if you're paying a rent of 10,000 rupees, that means 120,000 rupees per annum and 360,000 rupees for a period of 3 years is what is your contractual rent commitment under that contract, right? But if you are doing accounting under the Ind AS 17 model, then you will not record any asset or liability in your balance sheet. You will simply pay 10,000 rupees as rent to your landlord and record that as a charge to the P&L on an ongoing basis, that's my expense of using this property on an ongoing basis for a period of 3 years. That is the accounting we were doing under Ind AS 17. Now we completely change this model of accounting under Ind AS 116. Under Ind AS 116 now, what we are saying that you actually have acquired a right of use asset for a period of 3 years under this contractual arrangement, which is non-cancelable. So if you have acquired a right to use asset for a period of 3 years, you are also actually taking an obligation to pay 360,000 rupees under this contract to the landlord. Now, under this contractual arrangement, you need to record this asset and record this liability in your balance sheet as an asset and a liability, at a right of use asset and a right of use liability or right of use obligation. So 360,000 rupees is then now required to be discounted to the present value using an incremental rate of borrowing. Assuming that rate of borrowing is 10%, then 360,000 rupees to be discounted for 10% for 3 years. Let's say that number comes to 275,000 rupees. 275,000 rupees is the right of use asset, and right of use obligation is what you need to record in your balance sheet as an asset and liability. And this 275,000 rupees then now required to be amortized in your balance sheet as a depreciation cost. On the liability side, 275,000 rupees, you need to accrete interest cost on this on a per annum basis at the rate of 10%. So, and then you are paying also 10,000 rupees on a per month basis. So there will be in the P&L, you will now have two costs. One is the depreciation amortization cost of the right of use asset, and the interest cost, which is arising on account of unwinding of the liability. So these two costs, in the end of the day, your P&L will be debited for 360,000 rupees. But the timing of that will change, and the quality of the balance sheet changes significantly. So operating leases, which used to be an off-balance sheet transaction, is no longer an off-balance sheet transaction under Ind AS 116. That's the fundamental difference between Ind AS 116 and Ind AS 17, besides many other changes. But Ind AS 17 will be done away with. It's already been done away with and it is only available to you because possibly some of you may be doing examination under the old course and the new course, and that is why some of this is continuing. Otherwise, Ind AS 17 is no longer relevant for those companies who are going to use Ind AS as an accounting framework.
Right. So moving on, Sandeep, we have received two questions, one from Rishabh and one from Sanya Gupta. Rishabh is from Bangalore, Sanya is from Gurgaon, and these are related to more or less related to career questions. So I believe that we can take in an open Q&A. And
Sure.
Moving on to one more technical question, Dipesh Kukreja is asking from Agra, and he wants to understand the difference between Ind AS 115 and Standard 9, and how it is different from Accounting Standards 9 revenue recognition.
Right. So in the accounting standard 9, AS 9, which is to say, when do you record revenue, right? It was supposed to record revenue when there is a transfer of risk and reward, right? So there is a transfer of risk and reward and collectibility is reasonably assured. That is the AS 9 principle. AS 9 principle simply says that, is there a transfer of risk and reward from one party to another party, and is the collectibility of the contract is reasonably assured? If the answer to that is yes, you got to record revenue under Ind AS 9. And again, Ind AS 9, not Ind AS 9, AS 9. AS 9 is not descriptive at all, right? It was a standard which is like 3 pages, 4 pages revenue recognition. It doesn't talk about performance obligation. It doesn't talk about allocation of performance obligation. It doesn't talk about, manner, pattern of revenue recognition, so on. So AS 9, I would say, is a very primitive standard, of course, which kept us going good for a fairly long period of time, but has resulted into a lot of accounting diversity, right? Because of the in absence of a very comprehensive accounting standard, right? Whereas Ind AS 115 is a fairly comprehensive accounting standard which is suited to the current environment of complex revenue arrangement, is what we see across companies. So AS 9 was simply to say you record revenue for sale of goods or for rendering of services or for royalties, dividends and interest, right? This is what the broad coverage of that standard is, and record revenue when there's a transfer of risk and reward, and collectibility is in short. Whereas Ind AS 115, as I explained, is give you the whole framework to say that you got to look at a 5-step approach, which is to identify the contract with the customer, then determine your performance obligation, determine the contract consideration, allocate the contract consideration to each of the performance obligation, and then record revenue as and when these performance obligations are fulfilled. It also talks about the cost, that how do you do with the contract cost of acquisition of a contract or fulfillment of a contract, and then it also talks about large amount of disclosures is what you need to do. And then within these steps, there are multiple variations to say that how do you allocate the contract consideration to each of the performance obligation, in what scenario you need to identify multiple performance obligation, how do you deal with gross versus net, how do you deal with bill and hold, how do you deal revenue recognition on dispatch versus delivery, so on and so forth. So 115, I would say, is a fairly complex, very comprehensive accounting framework as compared to AS 9, which was in effect and still in effect for companies who are following Indian GAAP and not Ind AS as an accounting framework for revenue recognition. So if you're doing CA, if you've already done CA Inter, of course, you have to learn about AS 9, but now in finals you got to learn about Ind AS 115.
Thank you, Sandeep. So let's move on to the open Q&A. And one more exciting news, we have already got the names of the winners. So after this Q&A session, shortly we'll be announcing those names. So guys, please keep the excitement on. And Sandeep, I also request all the members, when you speak with Sandeep, please keep your questions short so that others also get the chance to speak and ask the question. So and thank you for all the positive comments, people. So we have a couple of questions, Sandeep, coming in. So I would request so Ankit, Anik Jain. So Anik, if you can start your video and your audio, and you're free to interact with Sandeep and ask your question.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Hi, sir. Sir, I wanted to ask, what are the problems being faced in implementation of Ind AS 116 by clients?
There are scores of challenges when you look at the implementation of 116, right? The step one is to first make a full inventory of all your lease arrangement in itself, right? we see that companies don't have a very comprehensive repository of all the leases they have. That's one challenge. The second is that how do you identify all the leases? So there is a key issue on embedded leases, right? So that's something which you need to ensure that all the lease type arrangements are also being identified by the company and again been evaluated, documented. Then the third challenge is that there are multiple accounting policy choices which is available to you. One is on transition, the second one is on an ongoing basis. So for a company to make appropriate evaluation and determination of those accounting policy choices, are very simple to say that should I do retrospective, should I do prospective, should I do modified retrospective, right? There are multiple accounting policy choices which are available. So how do you choose those accounting policy choices? Then there are a lot of practical expedients which are available under the standard to say that what do I do with the small value lease item? What do I do with short-term leases? How do I determine the lease term? What interest rate I should choose to do the discounting, so on and so forth. So there are multiple other decision points which you need to make. Now, once you've done all of this, then how do I maintain this, right? How do I maintain this? Should I continue to maintain this on Excel spreadsheets, or actually I try and leverage a technology solution to maintain this on an ongoing basis? So all of that is what a company needs to look at, or challenges is what we see if they were to implement Ind AS 116.
And for example, sir, if a lease is less than 12 months, so recognizing a ROU and a lease liability would be difficult for companies, right?
It depends. Not
leases.
Necessarily a difficult choice. Again, it's a choice which is available to the company to record or not to record. It's a cost benefit analysis a company has to make, that whether they want to record or not to record. If they want to record, they can record. If they don't want to record, that's the accounting policy choice. Even if they don't want to record, they need to make disclosures, right? So the information still needs to be gathered, and then the sufficient disclosure needs to be made. The choice is, or the decision is, that a company is more sensitive to EBITDA as a metric, or a company is more sensitive to operating profit as a metric. So depending upon what you are sensitive to in terms of P&L line item or on operating performance, you should take that decision. And of course, the cost of implementation or cost of tracking these small value or short-term leases, and how comprehensively you can track them and document them.
Okay. Right. Thank you, sir. It was a great session by you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anik.
Thank you, Anik. So moving on, Shivani Roy. Shivani, I request you please start your video and audio, and you're free to interact with Sandeep. Divya, you can also start if Shivani, in the meantime, she's taking time. Divya, you can ask your question. All right. So we're still waiting. So, all right. Rohit, if you can start your video and ask your question.
And I see Anurag wants to ask some question.
Anurag,
you there? Yeah. You can ask the question.
Anurag, yeah.
Good morning, sir.
Yes. Hi, Anurag.
Sir, my question was, how do banks implement ECL model? Because there are so many financial assets and it is not practically possible to apply ECL model to every advance given.
It is absolutely possible. It's not that it's not possible. See, when you look at a large number of assets, you follow a portfolio approach. Okay, you follow a portfolio approach, and basis the portfolio approach, you build your models, because banks have amazing history of credit defaults, right? So you have all the data point. The question is that how do you box the data point in appropriate statistical models? Once you put them into statistical model, then you can apply the ECL model. It's basically you're trying to preempt a possible loss versus providing for a loss when it is already been incurred, right? And then you got to, so depending upon, let's say you are providing loan to a high income category versus a low income category versus a middle income category, or you providing you giving a lending for industrial purpose versus housing purpose, or you providing a loan, let's say for buying commodities or for buying stocks. So depending upon the type of assets, depending upon the type of lenders, depending upon the type of jurisdiction, let's say you're lending in India versus you're lending in US versus you're lending in Africa. So you got to build out basically a comprehensive mix of your business model. You got to first understand your business model, then you got to segregate the risk in your business model, looking at a portfolio approach, that this set of customers, this set of lending carries this type of risk, because that's how you try to price your asset also, right? That's how you're trying to price this arrangement. So let's say if you're a microfinance company, right, you charge interest at the rate of 20%, right? But if you go to SBI and against the housing loan, you can borrow money at the rate of 8%. Why? Because house, there's a big security which is available to the bank, which is the house, right? And then the RBI, consider them as priority sector lending, and the less capital is required, etc., etc. Whereas from a microfinance company, the cost of lending itself is very high, and then the credit defaults, the risk of default is high, and that is why they need to charge more to cover the credit risk, right? So all the banks have been able to put together a model, depending upon a type of bank, a type of business model, a type of customers they're exposed to, they will be able to build the ECL model and do the appropriate provisioning, from that perspective as well. So when you will look at several companies which transitioned to Ind AS, transitioned to Ind AS 109, there was an accounting charge which was recorded by them on transition to Ind AS 109 on account of expected credit loss.
Sir, also I wanted to ask that US GAAP follows different model like current credit loss, and IFR, I mean, the Ind AS model is different. So if a bank is international bank, then how will they account for it? How will they account for it? Because one branch will be following suppose US GAAP model, and one branch will be following Ind AS model. Then how practically it is possible?
It is possible because then that branch has to follow two ledgers. One ledger for their own reporting for US purpose, the other ledger for reporting for IFRS purpose. So you got to maintain two sets of ledgers on which you got to follow two sets of accounting and then report appropriately. Your accounting framework has to be consistent at a consolidated level at which you are trying to do reporting. So you got to maintain two ledgers, three ledgers, four ledgers if you are maintaining multiple, if you're following multiple accounting principles. But for one accounting view, you got to be consistent, from that perspective. It is absolutely possible. Many companies do it, and we work with these companies all the time.
All right, Divya, you started your video. So if you can again, please, you're free to ask your question.
Hello, sir. It was a nice session. So can you please explain the hedging concept?
Hedging. Okay. So first, for you to understand hedging, you should understand what is derivative, right? A derivative is something which has to fulfill three criteria, right? Presence of an underlying, no or little initial investment, and to be settled at a future date. A very simple example of that is, let's say you go and buy Nifty options. If you've traded in stocks, you go and buy a Nifty option or a future. That's a derivative instrument, for example. Or a foreign currency forward contract is a derivative instrument. Or, for example, you purchase a stock, right? Let's say, and you haven't, the delivery will happen in 2 days, and you haven't paid yet because you're going to pay in 2 days, right? But you're exposed to the price volatility for this 2-day period before the delivery and after the delivery as well. But for the 2-day period, it is a derivative instrument. A simple example is that you are exposed to the price risk, which is the presence of an underlying, right? And then you have not made any investment yet because you will pay after 2 days, and hence you are exposed no or little initial investment, and it is going to be settled at a future date. You're going to settle this after 2 days. So that's a derivative arrangement, right? Accounting for all derivative arrangement is fair value through profit and loss account, unless there is an exception. So if you are scoped out, which is in this case, which is a regular way security trade, you are scoped out, and hence you don't need to do fair value accounting. But assuming you are not scoped out, you got to do fair value accounting through profit and loss account. Now, if you are not, the only exception to this fair value through profit and loss account is doing the hedge accounting. Hedge accountings are of three types, right? Cash flow hedge accounting, fair value hedge accounting, or accounting for net investment in a foreign corporation. So why you need to do hedge accounting? Hedge accounting is you're trying to manage now risk, okay? Why are you doing a derivative instrument? I talked about different risks in any financial asset or financial liability. The type of risk which we are exposed to is an interest rate risk, is a credit risk, is a currency risk, and it is a price risk. So there are 4 types of risk which you are exposed to in any instrument, right? If you're buying a bond, you are exposed to credit risk or the interest rate risk. If you're buying a equity share, you are exposed to the price risk. If you're trading in foreign currency, you are exposed to the currency risk, right? So on and so forth. So interest rate risk, credit risk, price risk, and the currency risk, right? So these are 4 different types of risk which we are exposed to, 4 types of financial risk. Okay, there could be 100 types of non-financial risk which we are exposed to. So for the financial risk which we are exposed to, you can now buy a derivative instrument. So a very simple example, let's say you have sold 100 goods worth $100 to your customer in US. You are an Indian company, you sold goods worth $100 to a US customer. So now on the day of sale, the rupee dollar was 75. That means you sold goods worth rupees 7,500 to your US customer, and in exchange, you will receive payment in US dollar, which is $100. Now you are exposed, there is an exposure which you are carrying, which is the exchange rate exposure. So rupee dollar tomorrow moves to 77, you will then receive 7,700, or if rupee dollar moves to 73, you will actually receive only 7,300, whereas at the time of sale, it was 7,500. Now as management, you want to minimize this risk. You say, I'm happy with 75. I neither want 77 nor I want 73. I'm happy with 75. So now what do? You go and sell a foreign currency forward contract to a bank. Now you go to a bank and say, Mr. Bank, I'm going to receive $100 from my customer after 2 months, and hence I want to sell you $100 after 2 months. And in exchange, I want you to give me 7,500 rupees, which is today's spot. Bank will say, okay, I will give you 7,500 rupees against $100, for which I will charge you a transaction fee. That transaction fee could be the 5 rupees. That 5 rupees, nothing but the cost of hedging. And then because this is a hedge instrument, which is a foreign currency forward contract, you are exposed to the variability of the hedge instrument till the time it matures. Okay, so now the accounting standard requires you a hedge instrument, which is this foreign currency forward contract, is a derivative instrument. The accounting which I explained, it required to be accounted for at fair value through profit and loss account. Because you are accounting for this at fair value through profit and loss account, it creates a mismatch in your balance sheet. So what you can do now, you can designate this hedge instrument against this hedge item, which is your foreign currency receivable. If you match the two and you are offsetting your risk, on one side you are exposed to the currency risk, you have used this foreign currency forward contract to offset that risk, which is inversely proportional. So if rupee dollar moves to 77, you will receive more rupee from your customer, but you will have to pay the excess which you're going to receive from the customer to the bank. So you are back to 75. So you want to minimize your currency fluctuation in the balance sheet. Now you achieve this by way of buying this foreign currency forward contract. Hedge accounting principles then will allow you to record this gain or loss on the hedge instrument and on the hedge item through other comprehensive income till the time it matures in a way. So you minimize your exposure in the P&L in the intermediate period and an ongoing basis, so that your P&L is not showing a gain in one period and a loss in another period. End of the day, you're going to receive 75 because you locked yourself to 75, and hence there is no gain or loss from your perspective. But because of the accounting rules, you may have a gain in one period and a loss in another period. The hedge accounting helps you to eliminate the volatility in the P&L by parking these gains or losses in other comprehensive income in the intermediate period. I hope that gives you some perspective on how to deal with hedge accounting.
Thank you, Divya. So Sandeep, we have time constant, but do you think we can take one more question?
Okay, last question. Last question we can take.
So Rohit, you can ask your question, please.
Hi Sandeep, I wanted to know the implication of event of default while determining the classification of equity versus debt. For example, a CCPS has been issued by a company where the company has discretion to either repay or convert or pay even the dividend. However, in the event of default, the instrument holder can put back the instrument and can compel the company to repay it. So how the event of default should be considered while evaluating the determination of equity versus liability? Thank you.
Right. And this event of default is linked to the other borrowings by that company. Is that what you're saying, Rohit? I think you're still on mute. You have to unmute him, Praveen.
Yes, Rohit, you have an option to unmute yourself, please.
Yes.
No, Sandeep, it is not linked. It is a standalone instrument. In fact, the company does not have any other borrowings.
No, but then that's the question. Then how then event of default will occur? Event of default can only occur that there is a borrowing, right?
So basically, when the CCPS was issued, there were the other terms and conditions within the share purchase agreement.
Okay.
So there were the certain conditions like the company will have to come with the IPO, or the company will have to do XYZ, etc. Because these event of default, the instrument can be put back.
Yeah. So it's very common is what we see. This is not called event of default. Basically, it is like, you got to evaluate every such event to conclude that whether that event is in the control of the company or whether that event is not in the control of the company. And a very simple example, which you said, is IPO. IPO is an event which is considered as an event which is not in the control of the company. If the company cannot control it, then it has to be recorded as a liability. So if there is an event that, for example, the company if company decides to borrow money in excess of 100 crores, for example, now that's an event is in control of the company. They may decide to borrow, they may decide not to borrow money. Then it will continue to be qualify as an equity. But if the event is linked to an IPO is not an event which is considered as a control of the company, then it will be considered as a liability instrument. So it depends on the event, whether that event is in the control of the company or not, is what will determine an appropriate accounting classification, whether it is in liability or equity, from the perspective of the issuer. So I hope that gives you a perspective, Rohit. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, your questions and enthusiasm. And I look forward to do many more sessions in the future and engage with all of you and share my experience, perspective, and help in whatever way possible I can. So over to you, Praveen.
Sandeep, before you leave, one last request. I have shared the name of the winners in chat box with you in private chat box. So if you can announce the name of the winners, that'd be wonderful.
There is a private chat box also, Praveen?
Yes. So you just, in your chat thread only, you'll see
I think why don't you go ahead and announce it, Praveen? I am good.
Just a second. All right. So to everyone, the first prize goes to Anurag. Just
awesome.
A second. I have, so Anurag Kalkar. Thank you so much. The second prize goes to Jitin Jitin. And then the third prize goes to Deep Mansukhani. Congratulations to all of you. We separately, will get in touch with you guys to deliver your gifts, prizes. And thank you, Sandeep, once again for this energetic and amazing, insightful session. And everyone is appreciating and everyone wants you to, discuss and come up with more such sessions, which, we'll try surely. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you all. Bye-bye.